First of all, let me just introduce myself. My name is Barry Miller. In case any of you don't know who I am, I'm an attorney, president of the Closing Agent, and I want to thank everyone that's here. We're also broadcasting live to all 5 offices. So hello, everyone out in the satellite offices. You do have your forms here in the satellites for the CE credit. So if you are getting CE credit, make sure to fill out the forms. We do need your license numbers. And pass them in. We can't take them now. We have to take them at the end of the class because the state says we have to ensure that you're here for the whole thing. So, you know, in our industry, property management became much more prevalent after the crash because everyone had property, what to do with it. And so a lot of agents got into it. A lot of them have gotten out of it since then, but a lot are still lingering in it. So what we're going to do today is go over some of the fundamentals, what's there, what's out there, some pitfalls that are out there. One of the biggest things that goes on in the property management is the biggest issues that come up is the leases. And let me just tell you right off, the FAR lease, people always say, oh, I use the FAR bar lease. There is no such thing as a FAR bar lease. It's the FAR lease. It's put out the Florida Association of Realtors. It's garbage. Okay, you should not use it. It's got a lot of problems in it. That's why the bar has not endorsed it. So what you should do is have a good lease. If you don't have a good lease, talk to us. We work with brokers and come up with a standard lease that we're constantly updating and making sure it's strong. Now the other thing is that's kind of good is from a property management standpoint, Florida Statute 83 is broken up into 2 parts. Part 1 is for commercial, part 2 is for residential. Florida generally is called a landlord state. It's geared more towards landlords. It's pretty easy to get people out versus, let's say we were in New York. New York, it's typical that sometimes an eviction could take 2 years. 2 years. Can you imagine having to keep that tenant for 2 years? Now they deal with things like rent control, which, believe it or not, there is some areas in Florida that do have rent control, like Miami Beach, not so much anymore. That's kind of faded out. Even in New York City, rent control is gone unless you're grandfathered in. So, you know, you hear that person in Midtown Manhattan that's got the beautiful 3-bedroom, 2-bath for $899 a month because they're there for life. And they still have it. So we're going to go through some of this stuff today. First off, did everyone download the app? If you haven't done that, we're kind of doing that. You'll see on there, you go to Poll Everywhere, download the app, then you'll be able to participate in the questions. And then you can, we're testing it out right now. If you love these classes, yes or yes. So make sure everyone has downloaded that so you can participate that, especially out in the branches. And this is a new interactive way. That way you can also ask questions, because we like to get your feedback. So while everyone's downloading that, make sure, what's everyone kind of seeing in the rental market? Does anyone think it's softening yet? No? Okay, rent still going up? Because, you know, I think downtown Orlando in some of the suburb areas are going to start softening because the inventory, I know downtown we've got 3 new towers with 300 units apiece. That's going to be about 1,000 new units coming online over the next several months. City Tower's already online. The one over by the library is going to be online soon, and the one over Lake Lucerne is coming online. So I think there's going to be a little bit of softening in the market. No? Very tough. Mm-mm. Yeah, that's green. We'll black it out, but. Huh? Oh. There we go. So how many people right now use software to manage property? What do you use? Folio? Folio? Anyone else use anything else? What's it called? Okay, never heard of that. Anyone else? Okay, AppFolio is a big one that a lot of people are using. Okay, has everyone downloaded the app? Okay, excellent. Yeah, once you get into Poll Everywhere, then you put TCAU, and then you get into it. All right, so let's talk about what the different tenancies are. So there's different tenancies on there. There's periodic tenancies, and periodic is a tenancy without a definite end that continues for specific periods. It ends when the tenant gives notice to the landlord with the intent to terminate. So that's periodic. Then you got tenancies at will. That's a tenancy without a definite end. It can be written or unwritten, and a period is determined by when rent is payable, month to month, quarter to quarter. Some people have annual. So you got to realize the differences between these periodic and tenancies at will. And then you have the third type, which is called a tenancy at sufferance. And that's when a tenant with a written will holds over, that they hold over after the term of the lease is ended. If the holdover gets written consent, then it becomes a tenancy at will. Now, this happens a lot. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is by Florida statute, if you hold over, the rent doubles. Now, what I've seen is some people put in their leases, if they hold over, it's 1.5 times. I always ask, why do they do that when the statute gives you double rent? And don't be afraid that if it does hold over, to go ahead and charge your double rent. I have one right now that it's actually a commercial tenancy, and what they're doing is they held over, and the tenant says, well, we're leaving on March 20th, don't bother us. This happened to be a situation, it's interesting because it comes up with rent abatement. So in this case, the commercial tenant wanted an abatement because when Hurricane Irma came, they couldn't use their space. Now, the landlord provided them some alternative space and some storage space, but they felt it wasn't good enough. They wanted no rent. And the landlord said, well, they have to pay us full rent. Well, I read the lease and said, well, it says abatement. So figure out how much it is per square foot that you gave them replacement rent, replacement space, and we'll calculate that that's what they owe plus their CAM. So we tried to settle it, and then they said, no, don't bother. We don't want to settle it. We're not going to pay anything. They owed us about $9 grand. They offered $3 grand. I said, why don't you just split the difference and we'll call it a day. My client said, no, never mind. We're going to pay you nothing, and we're just going to leave. We think we should be paid nothing. You should get nothing. So one of the things we're going to do, though, is since the lease was over, they are technically a holdover tenant. They're going to have a little surprise when we file suit against them. I'm going to charge them double rent from the time their lease ended in, I believe, in November until they're leaving March 20th. So I forgot to tell you that we're going to kind of put that in there when we do that. So sometimes you can use that holdover rent and the double rent as a negotiation tool. And people say, oh, I can't believe it. People would never just stay there. How many people have had that tenants just stay after they're supposed to leave? Yeah, it's crazy how they do that. All right, let's try your app. What type of tenancy involves a holdover tenant? Tenancy without will, tenancy at sufferance, joint tenants with rights of survivorship, holdover by destruction of tenancy. Very good. You guys are paying attention. All right, so it's not a tenancy at will, and then it is a tenancy at sufferance. Joint tenants with right of survivorship, that's what we use on deeds. And holdover by destruction, that's when they're really bad. That's when they get in and they're not what they're doing. Is the app working?
Well, it says, do you love this class?
That's the first question.
And then it doesn't say next.
It should automatically update itself, so probably something with your internet connection. Are you able to just reload that page?
Maybe just press reload. Is everyone else's working? Okay, good. Okay, so another thing that comes up a lot is the Another type of tenancy is subleasing. So, and tenants, for some reason, have got it in their heads that this is my place, and if I want to rent it out to somebody else, it's mine. I get to do it. They don't understand it's not yours. You don't have a right to do it. And their thing is, well, if I get somebody else, what do you care? Well, we don't get to vet them. We don't know who they are. And by the way, it's very dangerous. In today's world, how many of, well, I'm not going to ask, but everybody should be doing background checks and criminal checks on your tenants. If you don't, you're probably opening yourself up to liability. Because what happens if you've got someone on a sex offender list that you just rented to, and then they find out? Wait till your landlord or your owner finds out you did that and there's protesters around your building. Or find out someone has a criminal history. Or the other thing is they've been evicted 12 times. So you've got to do those background checks on people. You've got to. I mean, absolutely, absolutely have to. And that way it prevents when someone tries to sublet, they let someone in. You know, I had a tenant in one of my buildings over here recently. She says, well, I lost my job, I'm leaving. Well, you still have an obligation. And they're like, so what? I don't care. I have no job. Not going to. Well, I'll leave when I want to leave. I'm like, no, you're not. You're going to leave. And the other biggest thing is, as you all know, is I'm just going to use my security deposit as the last month's rent. No, 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 no. We'll go into that later. But that's a big no-no. So subletting, you've got to. Now, under Florida law, if there's no provision in the contract that says about subletting, you can sublet. Okay, just like an assignment of contract. If there's nothing that says you can't assign, contracts are assignable. So that's why, again, it's important to have good language in there that if it's assignable, you know, I like to put in it's assignable at the landlord's sole discretion. Because we want to make sure that it's up to the landlord. The landlord's got to control, not the tenant. We want to make sure who's in there, make sure they meet the criteria. Now, there's different parts of subletting. Part of it is you sublet the whole thing. Then you also get the tenant who goes in and then sublets a room or two. Or what's coming up more and more? Huh? Airbnb. Okay? So you've got to put provisions in there, and that's one thing in our next revision we're going to put is something, in our standard lease, is to put something specific that says you cannot Airbnb or anything VBRO or anything like that. The city of Orlando has just passed an ordinance now that you can Airbnb your residence if you live there. Okay, so you can, but you have to be there. So you can't be an absentee owner. So that opens up a whole new door. Now, you still got to be careful. If you live in an HOA that has a restriction against that, you can't do that. If you live in a condo that says you've got a minimum of, say, 7 months rental, you won't be able to do that. But be aware that new statute is out there, the new ordinance is out there in the city, so you've got to be aware of it and take it into account. So assignment, giving the remainder of the term. That's what I said. You got to make sure you have provisions in there saying you can't sublet and you can't assign. So now, if your landlord does allow an assignment, then the assignee steps into the shoes of that party. So you've got to get them to adhere to the lease. It happens more in commercial. Like I had a tenant in the neighborhood here that we rented it to a company. All of a sudden they're gone and some lawyers are in there. And I'm like, who are you? Well, we rent here. I said, no, you don't. Oh yeah, we do. And I'm like, well, what provision do you have from the landlord? Well, the tenant in here, I pay them, they pay you. And I'm like, well, no, you have to. So luckily in that situation, we went to the landlord and said, you can't do that. And they play stupid as usual. So we charged them an assignment fee, had to run the tenant through credit, and then had to make the new tenant sign a sublease that basically said they're going to abide by the original lease. So you got to be careful. These people will be sneaky. They'll try to go around it. They'll try to do whatever they can to do it. But then you get into the thing is, if you assign it, a lot of the tenants will say, well, I want to be released because you got a new tenant. Now, my feeling is no, you're not. You're going to sit there as the guarantor. Now, if they did it the right way, they had someone come along that wants to assign the lease to, and they're a strong tenant, maybe we'll allow them to do it. But if you're going to be sneaky about it, nope, you got to stay in there. I want you on the hook just in case. So sometimes you'll hear them say, I want to be released from that liability. My advice to clients is you don't. Rent. All right, so rent should be periodic and paid at the beginning of each period. Now, under the statute, it's payable without demand or notice. So has anyone ever had a tenant that said, oh, I didn't get an invoice, so I didn't pay my rent? Yeah. So you got to make sure that's covered. We've had tenants that try to do that. Again, a good lease is going to address that and have that in there. Now, most people have their rents due the first of the month. You don't have to. I've got some clients that have a lot of rentals, and he actually staggers them because he likes to do it for cash flow purposes. He has some that are due the 1st, the 10th, the 15th, and the 20th. And he says for his property manager, he also likes that too because they're not swamped at the beginning of the month. It's all spread out and even. So sometimes if you have a client that you're doing property management, they have several properties, you might want to suggest that to them. And they may say, wow, that's really a good idea. And it makes life easy for you too, because it flows it out much better. All right, there's certain things you can't do in the lease. So one thing you can't do is waive any rights, remedies, or requirements of the law. And you can't limit your liability. Like, for example, in regular contracts, like I just had one the other day, over something, and it was an online service, and they said, we limit our liability to $50 per transaction. So first of all, I didn't sign the contract because I said, that's ridiculous. You mean, if something goes wrong and you completely screw up and it costs me $20,000, you just go, hey, Barry, here's a check for $50. Sorry. So no, they ended up actually changing it to $50,000 in that contract. I wasn't too happy about that, but it was still enough to cover what anything could happen. But in a lease, you can't limit your liability. So if you ever have a landlord that comes in and says, oh, I have, my standard provision, my liability is limited to, 1 month's rent, that's illegal. You can't do it. So if a prohibited provisions are present, then the party that suffers damages can recover. So you can't put that in if you can't, there'll be damages. We don't see that a lot, which is good, but just be aware of it. So here's the biggest rub where tenants go after landlords. And by the way, has anyone ever, I won't say who it is, has anyone in here ever come across the law firm? There's a couple of them in town here where their entire practice is representing tenants and they go after landlords. Anyone had her come after you? Okay, but there's an attorney in town. I respect what she does. She represents her tenants. She mainly goes after slumlords, so I really don't have much sympathy for those landlords. But man, goes after them and drills them and tries to do class actions against them. So one of the things they go after is failure to maintain. So the statute says you've got to follow building, housing, and health codes. Now, believe it or not, there's some jurisdictions that don't have some of these. They may not have housing codes, smaller counties, smaller municipalities. So if not, you have to maintain the property in a normal and reasonable period. One of the big things is you got to keep plumbing in a working condition. You have to have screens. Screens always comes up. I don't know why. But people always ask this. Yes, under Florida law, you have to have screens on the windows.
Not every window, just a window in each room.
Sorry?
Isn't it just a screen in at least one window?
Any
in each
window
room?
that can be opened, even a sliding door.
It just says, no, you can't just get away and say, oh, one window out of the 50 has a screen, I'm good. No, that's not what the statute means. It means they're all supposed to have screens. Now, if something's inoperable, if you've got a shower, glass that doesn't open, of course, you don't have to put a screen on it. But this comes up more and more. And for some reason, this must spread on the internet because the tenants always kind of use this. You have to keep plumbing in working condition. All right, but this is how crazy it is. But this always comes up. You don't have to give air conditioning. You have to give heat. You don't have to give air conditioning under Florida law. And that amazes some people.
What if they rented it with air conditioning and then the air conditioning breaks?
Okay, that's a duty to maintain. So yes. So,
Would that be the same for irrigation?
well, you have to look at the words of your lease. So some of the question was, does you have to maintain the irrigation? No, if there's nothing in your lease that says anything about irrigation, who's responsible and all that, then if the tenant says, oh, by the way, you need to install a sprinkler system because I don't want to water the lawn, or you can go, no, there's no duty to do that. So again, it's good to have it addressed what's in there. Now, another big problem that we have over the years is there is a sprinkler system. The tenants don't use it because they don't want to pay the water bill. So for example, in our lease, it says if there is a sprinkler system, the tenant has a duty and must use the sprinkler system in accordance with the county or city code, which around Central Florida, it's you can water twice a week. So they've got to do that. And that's a big rub because they don't do it. But what I always recommend to people is when you rent to your tenant, disclose, same thing when you sell property, disclose. Let them know up front. There is a sprinkler system. I want to let you know that it is set to go off twice a week per the county code. Traditionally, this is what the water bill is. I don't want you to think it's a $20 water bill. Your water bill is going to be $80, and that's what it will be with running it. And try to do, to tell them that they have to do that. All right, they have to, you have to provide extermination for rats, mice, roaches, ants, and wood destroying organisms and bed bugs. Provisions for locks and keys, common areas, garbage removal, functioning facilities, and you have to have smoke detectors. This is the biggest thing where I can't believe in this day and age, this is an issue. We just did if anyone saw it about a month ago, I just did a story with Channel 9 News. They had a woman who rented a unit and they gave her like a free month's rent, but the place was full of mold. And they were going to help her maintain it and fix it. They gave her a bucket of paint. So Channel 9 went after her. And when the reporter came in and talked to me, interviewed me, one of the things I said is, well, have you called code enforcement? No. We'll call code enforcement. Well, one of the first things I said is there's no smoke detector in this unit. By the way, if your landlord's really cheap about it, they give them out free at the fire station. So there's really no excuse. Because let me tell you, if there's a fire and someone gets hurt, there's no smoke detector, major liability. Now, you have an obligation to maintain. So a lot of these things, a lot of this comes up too about, do you have to provide extermination services? No. If your lease says you're not providing that and it's the tenant's responsibility, then you can change, for example, that to them. But you can't put in there the tenant's got to maintain their own smoke detector.
So instead of should install, it should say must install.
Yes, they must have a working smoke detector. The landlord has to set up utilities and garbage removal, but again, you can put in there that the tenant has to pay it. So for example, you can't rent a house that has no meter and then say to the tenant, oh, well, if you want service here, you're gonna have to pay to have from the line, from the pole installed to the house. And the tenant says, well, I called the utility company and that's $5,000. The landlord says, well, that's your problem. No, you have to have the setup there to have it available. Same thing, I would argue that if there was no meter there, the landlord could say, well, it's available. You have to put your own meter in, and the meter's $2,500. That's probably questionable. I think the courts would come down on the side of the tenant in that case and say, come on, you got to have a meter there. Okay, the other thing is a landlord is not responsible for conditions that the tenant or their guests create. And this is always a problem because something goes wrong and then you as the property manager go out and you're like, well, no, we're not paying for that hole in the wall. Well, I didn't do it. Well, obviously I didn't do it as the landlord. Obviously one of your guests or invitees or someone did that. And they always go, well, I don't know how it got there. So again, the landlord is not responsible for something they do. I always love the stories of the worst trashed unit. We had one about a year ago that was the worst. They literally put a hole in every wall in every room. They took the granite with a sledgehammer, broke it in several pieces, took that sledgehammer into every appliance. I mean, just really, really went after it. They filed a police report. I told them you're going to need to file a police report. But these people, this was so malicious. I could not believe it. Could not believe it. So you've got to be careful what some of these people will do. Of course, you have to, the landlord, comply with building, housing, and health codes, keep it clean and sanitary. Now, that doesn't mean your landlord needs to clean, from your slobs that are tenants. You have to keep it and maintain it that way. So, for example, let's say there's a septic system. You can't, as the landlord, go, well, you must be using the toilet too much. It's your fault that the septic is backing up and all that. You got to maintain the system on that. Remove garbage that's there, keep up the plumbing, and the tenant has to use the utilities in a reasonable manner. So again, the tenant cannot destroy, deface, damage, impair, remove parts off the premises, and disturb neighbors or breach the peace. That's a quiet enjoyment. Now that's another thing that always comes up. The neighbor will call, they're loud, they're causing problems, things like that. The other thing is do everything in writing. And the other thing you got to be careful is how you communicate with your tenant. Because what happens today is through AppFolio or some of the other systems, it has an electronic system. Here's the problem. Let's say they're causing some issue and you've got to send that 7-day letter to your, and we'll get into this. There's a 7-day letter the landlord sends to the tenant says to the landlord to fix stuff, but then the landlord can send something to the tenant. You got 7 days to correct the problem. So let's say you send them a text message because you guys love doing business by text, okay? Text is for friends, not for business, okay? I got a case right now where we're having to prove that there was a counteroffer accepted by text. And the judge is going to decide. We'll have to see whether the judge says that's binding or not, because they never did it in writing. It was day of closing. They had to fix some carpet. They said, we'll give you a $3,000 credit. The buyer said yes, then wouldn't close. So we're arguing before the court that that's binding. She should have closed. I'm hoping the judge is going to accept it, but it's a bad way to do business. So a lot of you do it. So here's the deal. Say you send a text or an email. Something's wrong with the tenant. Will that be binding? The answer is you got to look at your lease, because the lease controls. And if the lease says communication has to be in writing, sent via U.S. mail, certified mail, return receipt requested, your notice is no good. Can't use that as a basis to get rid of your tenant. If you're going to use an electronic service, put in there that service via the communication system, via AppFolio, a property management system is considered good notice. So you got to make sure your notice requirement is.
Can you add email in there instead of certified mail?
Yeah.
It's a lot to just talk to somebody.
Yeah, definitely. You got to make sure that your lease, my suggestion is if you use one of those property management systems, put in their notice through that system, or AppFolio or any similar rental management system, property management system shall be sufficient notice. So make sure you have that in there. All right, so your landlord could collect damages caused by the tenant. Now, here's the big thing, ordinary wear and tear. All right, so we always get into that. What's ordinary wear and tear? I have some landlords that every time a tenant moves out, they charge them with painting the unit, and they say that's above ordinary wear and tear. It's not, okay? If you're going to think you're going to, I have some landlords that they just go, I don't really care. I paint it all the time, and I charge them for the whole thing. If it ever goes to court, you're not going to get away with that, okay? Now, if there's a hole in the wall, yes, you know, you got to use the reasonable standard. But be careful because ordinary wear and tear, every case is different, and you've got to realize what it is. I mean, I have some tenants that they'll go, oh, my dog scratched the floor. You got a pet deposit from me, and that's normal. All pets scratch the floor. Nah, that probably isn't. Or you got that pet deposit, that's okay. That covers it. No, it doesn't. So again, communicating with your tenant when they move in as to what the expectations were, if they have a pet, explain to them that pet deposit, but also explain to them is if the pet does scratch up the floor, scratch up the molding or anything that's not ordinary wear and tear, you will be charged. I'm just letting you know right up front. Again, setting expectations, it solves problems down the road. One thing that I've just put into my lease that I use now is I'm putting in there holes for picture hanging is no longer allowed. All right, we put in there they have to use the Command 3M or similar products. Those things can hold everything. All right, the only thing it probably can't hold is a TV. And quite frankly, I don't want my tenants putting one of those big, huge TV things in the wall because they're huge. We're actually considering in some of our units of actually installing the TV mounted holders and just having them there permanently. You know, the bad thing is, of course, you put it on this wall and they'll go, I wanted it on that wall. But, you know, ones we're doing is that way to prevent that. So consider doing that of saying no holes, because then you all know, because you get a hole and you patch it, it never matches, you can never do it. So just say to them from now on, use the 3M products, they're great. And then you've completely eliminated that problem. All right, the security deposits is always the fun one. So it should be held in a separate non-interest bearing account, or it can be in a separate interest bearing account where they'll receive interest of at least 75% of the annualized interest or 5% per year. By the way, I don't know anybody that puts it in an interest account. And if you have any thought of doing so, put it right out of your mind. The bookkeeping will drive you crazy. You're going to figure out the interest. First of all, what do they pay? 0.5 or something? 0.05? You know, even during the heyday when they're paying 5% on interest, to calculate it out is just not worth it. So just tell them it's going to be in a non-interest bearing account. The other thing is you can post a surety. Nobody does that either. Nobody does that. One interesting thing is, and you guys tell me what it is, there was a time that a lot of the apartment complexes, when they opened up to fill them up, were charging no security deposit if you had like a 675 or higher credit score. Is anyone seeing that anymore? Yeah, they were just doing that. I know Steelhouse did that when they opened because they were real smart. They were one of the first new apartment complexes downtown, filled it up. Hardly anyone I know that lived in there had a security deposit, and they sold that building for like 10 times what they paid for it and made a killing and got up. That was part of their strategy. I won't be surprised if you see these new towers that are opening up start doing that just to fill it up. Figuring, look, if they got a high enough credit score, they got a good job, they're not going to run out on the rent, and it's a way to fill up your building. So again, for property management, put it in a separate account, non-interest bearing. And just the other thing too is with your bank loves to have those accounts because it helps on your analysis. And if you don't have your escrow account on your analysis, you need to have a talk with your bank. Because if you got a good escrow account, you should not be paying 1 penny in bank fees. You know, because they get you for everything today. They charge you to deposit money for everything. If you're on analysis, have them do it all. If your bank, and a lot of the big banks don't do this because they like getting the fees, I always recommend you look at a community bank or a credit union, because if you do your security deposit with them, you'll pay no fees with them, which is a good thing to save money. Never commingle your landlord's funds with security deposits, all right? Separate account. Okay, now that doesn't mean that when the money comes in, it can go into your escrow account and then you disperse from there. It's just don't commingle the money after it becomes rightfully that of your landlord. Okay, the security deposit. So what happens is within 30 days, you have to give notice of security deposit in the lease or within 30 days after receipt. So obviously you want to make sure you have the right language in your lease. No one wants to be giving notice 30 days afterwards. Why make double work? So just do it right in your lease, have the magic language in there. And then, and then the other thing too is if it changes, you want to make sure that you give them notice. You must notify within 30 days. Now, there is an exception. If the landlord has 5 units or less, you don't have to have a separate account. For property managers, no. But if you yourself, let's say, have 5 units or less, you don't have to have a separate account. It can be commingled. Again, this is part of the statute that favors landlords, so that will happen. All right, so here's the deal, and this changed in the last few years, and everyone gets confused at that. When they vacate, the landlord has 15 days to return the deposit. All right, so let's say everything's good, immaculate tenant, it's great. Get that check to them within 15 days. You're done. Or the landlord has 30 days to give notice of intent to claim the deposit, and you got to give the reason. If the landlord gives no notice within 30 days, the landlord loses the right to impose the claim. So
Business days or just 30?
calendar days. Calendar days. Yeah, business days is not by statute. All right, so what I always tell everyone to do is, let's keep it simple, all right? Just make it your practice within 15 days, you're going to either give the money back or send the letter. Because you know what happens, these tenants are smart. On the 16th day, where's my money? They usually ask on the 3rd day. But
The day of walkthrough.
yeah. Oh, and the other thing is, this is the most important thing. Do a walkthrough with a sheet of paper, have a form where everyone signs off when you rent it, and then a walkthrough when they leave. And when they leave, if they just leave, go do it yourself with somebody, so you got a witness, and walk through and mark things, take pictures, because of course they'll leave and say the place was immaculate, and they'll go, I don't know how that hole got in the wall. Like, because they all leave and sometimes they don't tell you. Try to schedule the walkthrough, do it with them, and then have when they rent it, sign off. And say to your tenant, I want you to make sure everything is okay, because if it's not, you're going to be charged for it at the end. And you know, if there's something there, be honest with them and just say, yep, okay, there's a stain on the carpet. I understand that. You're not going to be responsible for that, or whatever it is. And then when they leave, when you're doing the walkthrough too, well, you know, there is this stain. Well, that's ordinary wear and tear. Well, no, if the carpet got worn a little bit, that's ordinary, but stains are not ordinary wear and tear. Just to let you know, we're going to have our carpet people come in and clean that. You know, it's about $100, and that will be a deduction. Or I'll have my guy come in. Okay, that's up to you whether you want to or not. I don't recommend it. I always say to them, well, you had your opportunity to do that. Your tenancy is now over. The landlord won't allow anyone else to come in the property. We're going to have our people do it. So just kind of go through it with them. So
when you're doing that though, Barry, I'll go and meet them and pick up the keys, but I won't have any conversation with them at that time.
why?
Just because they expect you at that point to tell them, yeah, you're gonna get all your money back. Well, then we go in there and find out that they pulled the plumbing out, that there's fleas, that there's all kinds of things. So I will go in there and say, okay, everything, you know, whatever, and we'll try light bulbs and stuff, but I won't tell them anything.
Well, yeah, I agree. So the question is she doesn't communicate with them at that time. I agree. Don't make a commitment at that time that says, you know, you're good. But I like to do the walkthrough with them. And even when they sign, saying on your form is to say, you know, this is a visual inspection. It does not include, this does not guarantee that you'll be getting your entire security deposit back. It is subject to further testing. So you want to do that. But I find it good to do is because if there is something, they know it, they've signed off on it, they don't come back and say, no, there was never a stain on that floor. If there was a stain, why didn't you point it out? Why didn't you tell it to me? And then you got to go, well, I don't do that. And they're going to go, well, you know, you should have told me that. So I find it good. Keep the communication good with them. Try to keep it positive with them. And, you know, there's no reason to get confrontational. If they're just going to be totally confrontational and say, look, I'm not here to argue with you. I'm just the landlord's representative. My job is just to make a list on here, and you know, we'll take it from there.
What if you're doing that and you see that something's wrong, you show that to them, you write it on the form, but they refuse to sign it because it wasn't their fault, that wasn't like that, it was given to me like that, blah, 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 blah.
Right, then you just write on there, tenant refuses to sign.
Okay.
Yeah, you can just put they refuse to. Yeah. Look, most people know what they do. They know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also part of the approach too. You know, if it's, you know, like the carpet, say, look, I understand you couldn't have a chance to clean the carpet. They'll probably go, yeah, I meant to, and I couldn't get someone to do that. And say, look, you know, we got to do it. Our standard, and you're going to know going in. Our standard carpet guy charges $100. That's pretty reasonable. You know, it's going to be our standard clean out fee on that, so it won't be a surprise. And most people will say, I understand. Yeah, you're going to have the bad ones that don't. But you know, the security deposit obviously is the biggest rub where things happen. All right, how does a landlord make a claim upon a tenant security deposit? A, by serving a notice of termination within 15 days following the termination of the tenancy, by posting a notice at the tenant's new address that the landlord is making claim upon security deposit, by filing suit, or by serving D, serving a notice of intention to make claim upon the deposit within 30 days subsequent to the termination of the tenancy. Okay, the answer is D. Okay, the serving notice of termination, it's not a notice of termination, it's a claim. And that 15 days is if there's no damage, you have 15 days to give them their money back. So D is the right answer. Within 30 days, but you'll all take my advice and I'll do it within 15 days, and then there'll be no confusion, and just get it out. Okay, questions. If you have any kind of questions, any of the branches, just kind of type them in. So let me tell you one other thing on the security deposit that is a big misconception of. So let's say we have a $1,000 deposit and you rented, and I send you within 15 days that I'm making claim cleaning fee, $250. I take out the $250, I give you a copy of the bill, send you a check for $750. You then, as a tenant, write a letter back saying, I contest this, I don't think it's due, you owe me the money. That place was, you know, I had Hazel come in and clean it. It was spick and span. Okay, so what happens then? Anybody?
The money stays in escrow.
What's that?
The money stays in escrow. It's settled. The balance.
Normally we wouldn't send a check.
Yeah, you sent a check with it.
When you have to send the claim first and before you send it.
Well, you can send it with it. You certainly can. Yeah, I have some landlords, what they do is they just send it with it. I have one landlord that also puts in there too, the negotiation of this check is and satisfaction and settlement of any and all claims. See, a lot of tenants think, oh, well, if I contest it, or let's say they keep the whole deposit, that the landlord is got to go to court and prove that he's entitled to keep that deposit. And tenants think that, and that's a big fallacy. The tenant would have to bring a suit against the landlord. Has anyone ever had a tenant that has sued his landlord to get back the security deposit they made claim on?
Yeah, it's too expensive.
Huh?
It's too expensive.
Right. Most of them don't do it for that reason. Again, that's one of the reasons why our act, our Landlord-Tenant Act, is very landlord-oriented. Very rarely have I seen a tenant go and try to sue to get the deposit back. Now, what you guys are as a property manager is held with, well, okay, well, wait a minute, how can I release the deposit when there's a dispute on it? So what some of my brokers do is they'll release it to their landlord upon written request, but they require that the landlord indemnify them in case the tenant does come after them. All right, so that way, if they do. Now, if the tenant does come after them, they shouldn't sue you as the property manager. They should sue the landlord because you are their agent. You're their agent. Okay, ooh, lots of questions. What if the tenant cleans the carpet, but the stain did not come off? Does the landlord still insist to have the carpet cleaned again? Well, that's up to the landlord. The landlord can say, come clean it again, but if it's during the walkthrough, at that point, the landlord can say, well, you've had your chance. I'm having my cleaners come in and I'm going to charge that against your security deposit. The landlord's under no obligation to give the tenant a second bite at the apple. What happens if the post office loses the certified notice? Well, you're only under an obligation, excuse me 1 second. Hello? Good. Great, tell them I'll have someone there in a second. Thanks. You call Luca and tell him the blinds are here. So funny story is, I just finished renovating a condo to rent. A bunch of blinds is here to install the blinds. So if the post office loses the certified notice, you're under obligation to send it by certified mail. Obviously, today's world, you can see it being tracked online. I, by the way, hate certified mail. I think it is the worst. I always put in my leases, it can be sent certified mail, return receipt requested, or by nationally recognized overnight carrier, UPS or FedEx. Because the certified mail is what is it, like it's like $5 or $6 now? $6.75. Well, you can send usually a UPS or FedEx for like $8 or something. I spend the extra $5 and send it UPS overnight, and signature required. You got to be careful because sometimes they'll leave it. You have to make sure it's signature required because otherwise they'll just leave it. If they do, you can't do it. So if they, ooh, what happened to some of those questions? Huh?
The new questions are on the top.
They're moving down.
Did the other ones disappear?
From the bottom.
Oh.
Because there was this.
Okay, so if they lose it and you see online that they lost it certified, send it again. Definitely send it again. On a security deposit, when does day one start? When they leave or turn in the keys. Actually, the 30 days starts from the end of the tenancy. All right, so if their lease was up on the 30th, the first starts the first. Now, if they don't turn the keys in until the 3rd, then the argument would be is you're a holdover tenant for 3 days and it would start then. I still would use the 1st to be safe. But technically, if they didn't turn the keys into the 3rd, you could go after them for 3 days for double rent.
Barry, on that, what if their lease wasn't up? They just moved out.
Okay, that's an abandonment. So again, if they abandon the premises under the statute, you need to send them a notice of abandonment and say that the property was abandoned because you don't have the right to go in there unless you send out that notice of abandonment. There is some exceptions. For example, if clearly you look in the windows and it's gone, I mean, it's just completely cleaned out, there's nothing in there, it's obviously. But if there's stuff in there, you have to send the letter as required by the statute and let them know before you go in.
Where would you send it to if you don't know?
Last known address.
So that's saying that.
Right, you always have to send the last known address. And by the way, in case any of you don't know the trick, there's 2 tricks. If you don't know where they are, if they have a mailbox, you look in the mailbox, and if you see a yellow sticker, that means they put it in from the post office to where the mail was forwarded to, you can see where it's forwarded to. The other trick is you send a notice, or sometimes just an empty envelope, that says to the tenant, do not forward, return address requested, and then the post office will send it back. They charge a fee of what the forwarding address is. So then you know where they've gone to. We can send the balance of deposit with the claim letter. Yes, you can. You can. When the tenant receives a notice of claim, they reply via email does the landlord need to respond? See, that's where we get into the lease. If the lease says only a notice is by certified mail and it's by email, technically you don't. If the lease says that the tenant must, right, technically you don't, all right? Personally, if I was advising a client, I would say don't ignore it. Because a judge may sit there and say, well, even though it says certified mail, I'm a court of equity and it would have been equitable. Landlord, did you get the notice? Yeah. Well, you really should have done something. So technically you don't, I still would, just to make sure there's no problems. Okay, did I get them all? Can we send bound? Yeah, get that. Okay. So we got all of those on there. All right, we're going to take a short break. Let's see, it's 10:55. So let's come back in 10 minutes. Get food down there?
They're setting up the food right now.
Okay, so they're kind of setting up the food down there, so kind of enjoy that. I'll be up here if anyone's got any questions. Oh, tell a little about her company and.
Awesome. Hey guys, good afternoon. My name is Leslie and I'm with American Liberty Mortgage. My husband and I have a boutique mortgage lending firm in Orlando, and my mom actually has the other 2 branches in Florida, and we are 3 branch offices of a national lender. So we are the lender. So I always say we get to hit the button to fund the transactions. We don't have to wait on a clear to close or all that craziness. So that's one great thing about our team, and we've been doing this for a long, long time. If I ever get stumped, my mom's been in the business for like 25 years, so I always say, let me call my mentor / mommy. So yeah, it's kind of a family business, and been doing this since I graduated college. So I appreciate you guys letting me sponsor you today and have a few minutes of your time. And we were going to just use this time as a stump the lender kind of session. So if you have any like burning questions or anything that maybe a pain point that you always wonder, like, why does this happen a week before closing that I find out my borrower wasn't approved or their pay stubs weren't submitted, or, you know, any questions like that, I'm happy to answer. So feel free to fire away. Oh, okay, that's right. We're texting in questions. Okay, so how can I get more buyers approved? Yeah, that's a great question. And it definitely, oh, I skipped one. Oh, okay, very good question. So I'll finish with how can I get more buyers approved? Definitely takes, you know, we're all number crunchers. I have my MBA, certainly like a numbers kind of gal, but what you don't realize that is so important in your lender is some creativity, right? It takes a lot of problem solving and creative sort of brainstorming to be able to get someone in an approved position that may not be on the outset. How can we add income or pay off a car? Maybe they don't realize that their debt to income ratio doesn't need to include a car payment if the car only has 10 more payments left. Like little things like that that are kind of pro tips that definitely make a difference. So getting more buyers approved is obviously important for those of you who are working with buyers, and, you know, just opens up your market and helps you make more money. We are all about helping our real estate partners close more deals. I think the interest rates are going up. I can answer that one really quickly. They will absolutely be in the 6s from my humble opinion by the end of the year. So we're already seeing them in the 5s. Yeah. So tell all of your clients that, because, you know, the interest rates have been crazy low for a long, long time. The feds keep raising the rates to try to combat, you know, any false inflation, we'll say, and they're going to keep going up. We do work with foreign buyers. The foreign income is different for every country. So a Canadian foreign national has a different income verification than, let's say, a buyer from Brazil. So that's a great question. We do not need credit for the foreign nationals. They don't have U.S. credit history, so we don't pull a credit report on those buyers. Typically, it requires 25%, sometimes 30% down, so they do need to have some cash, and they need to be a true foreign national. So true foreign nationals don't have a social security number. Permanent resident aliens do have a social security number, and they're treated just like any other buyer. Which one have I kind of been jumping around? Definitely this one, filtering prospects better. I don't want to waste my time. You guys don't want to waste your time. In our business, our time is our money, right? So filtering buyers, the number one thing, it's not 2007 anymore. The number one thing is, are you self-employed? If you are, okay, you are in the challenge desk, just like probably all of us in this room, right? We don't tell the government all the money we make. We write off a lot. So whatever you tell the government you make, that's the only thing we're going to be allowed to use. So if you are self-employed, that's a challenge number one. But the best way to filter buyers, how long have you been on your job and are you W-2'd? How do you make money? The job and the income stability is absolutely the key factor. Credit issues we can work around, down payment issues we can work around, but the job and the money. Just think about how, the market crashed back in the late 2008, 2009. It's because, of that job stability and the borrower's ability to repay the loan. We close, I was just telling Janelle, we're crazy busy, like everybody. Thankfully, it's certainly a blessing. We are having a record month in March. We plan to close, we have scheduled to close 20 transactions, and we have a very small team. My branch is, I have 3 loan officers, my husband, myself, and our executive assistant. So that is a lot for my little sweet team. Of course, we have processors and underwriters that we collaborate from other branches when we need to. And we think we're different, because of our collaborative approach. Honestly, just like you guys on the realtor side, in this business, there's no sets of training curriculum per se, because every human is different, every scenario is different, every background. Anytime there's a human element, there's going to be some twists and turns to the plot. So I particularly think that in our business, nothing can, trade out for experience. Experience is everything, because if you've had that scenario and you know what to do, that is what the key is. So we have some really veterans on our team, some folks who have been in the industry longer than anyone. So I feel like that is a huge advantage, and I definitely take advantage of that all the time. I feel like I've been in the industry for just long enough to still have not a full head of gray hair, but still young enough to be able to leverage technology and try and keep up with the millennials. So we try to make that very convenient for your clients as well. I think that's all. Did you guys did you have a question, sir? Sorry, okay. Did I answer all of them? Hopefully. Yeah, so the interest rates are a fascinating thing to watch for the nerds like us. So keep an eye on those rates. And thank you guys again.
What's your crystal ball say for interest rates?
Yeah, I do think that they will be in the 6s by the end of the year.
6s?
Yeah, I do. I know. I hope I'm not right, Barry.
My crystal ball says I don't think it'll get that high. Next year, yes. I do think there's going to be a correction in the market next year. We're in for a recession. We're long overdue for a recession, folks. So next year, we're definitely going to have that. You can't tell. I mean, every day is a different, it's a different forum in the circus in Washington, so you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's a good point.
One of the things that I've seen a lot, and I don't know if you hear that, so we'll share this for a second. One of the things I'm seeing that's frustrating on a lender side, and if you're on the seller side, which most of the time I am, is it seems that we have buyers who are intentionally sabotaging their loans to get out of the contract. Are you seeing this a lot?
Not a lot, Barry, but I love that you brought up that question, because as the lender, we always feel like we're in an awkward place, because if you're my buyer, even if I think dude, what's the problem? Everything's going great. What do you mean all of a sudden you're really concerned about the AC only has 10 years left? Then the only way they can get their escrow deposit back is a letter from me. And really, maybe I don't think they should get their escrow deposit back, but at the end of the day, where's my ethical line, where I should say? So anyways, that's a great question. I don't see it a lot, but I have seen it more than I would say I have seen in the past, that they're just very.
Yeah, I just had one last week, and it was very frustrating because it went through inspection. Everything was fine. This buyer actually gave the inspection report to the seller. Then it came back, and they got a decline from the lender, and it said due to property conditions, because before that, the buyer had come to the seller and said, well, we want you to put a new roof on. And the seller said, no, your inspection said there's nothing wrong with the roof. It probably has another 3 to 5 years left on it. But now the buyer's got the bug that they want a new roof. So they got their lender to turn the loan down based on property conditions.
Which really, I would argue, because we don't, not that we don't care about the inspection, but I don't care about the inspection. I don't need a copy of it. I don't need to see it. All I care about is what my appraisal says. So if the appraisal didn't note a roof issue, then that's not really my wheelhouse.
So what we did in that is my seller is now contesting, we're not giving back the deposit. But I'm seeing this more and more and more. So as on the seller side, keep in touch with the buyer's lender to make sure everything's going well. The other thing, we've got one right now where my buyer's agent actually had a buyer's agent rep agreement. And if you go out and show buyers properties without having them sign it, you're a fool. And don't use the FAR because it doesn't have a provision for attorney's fees and it makes you go to arbitration. We have one we're revised will give you that says you do get attorney's fees. So in this case, the buyer sabotaged the loan by refusing to give the loan officer his tax return. So of course they turned the loan down. It's a $40,000 commission. We're representing the buyer's agent. We're suing the buyer for his $40,000 commission. And our star witness is going to be the loan officer to say, yeah, he was perfectly approved for this, except he didn't give us his tax returns. So we couldn't give him the loan.
That's
So
we're not
we're doing
always
it.
the bad guys.
Nah, just like the title company, we're not the bad ones either. But good, always work good with your vendors, and that's the important there. All right, again, thanks
you
for
guys
sponsoring.
your time, and have a great afternoon. Thank you, Barry.
Thanks. Okay, something that came up during the break was, what was it I said someone to ask about? Re-renting a property. So say your tenant leaves early, abandons, just takes off, all that. One of the things you got to be careful of in today's market. So let's say you're renting that property for $1,500 a month, and there's 10 months left on the lease, and maybe you gave that person a bargain. You're renting it for $1,600. You gave them $1,500 off. Now you got to be careful, because if you put it back on the market and rent it for more than that $1,500, that extra money has to get credited to the tenant. So you can't go after them for a windfall. Any extra money you make, the landlord cannot be unjustly enriched. Now, can the tenant go make an argument and say, all right, why 10 months left? You got $100 more a month. That's $1,000. You should give me $1,000 more. Yes, they can. Now, let's say there's 10 months left, but you rent it for 12 months. Well, they wouldn't be they wouldn't be entitled to all 12 months, just the 10 months. So be careful of that, because the tenants will have you fall into that trap. And if you get extra rent, your landlord can't just pocket it. What was the other thing you and I were talking about? We said we were going to bring up.
For me, when
Yeah.
she turned in the keys and 2 months left on the lease, but.
Oh, right. That's what I was going to say. Okay, so let's say we have a 12-month lease, and in month 10, the tenant's here for 2 months, ups and leaves. Now, you rented it for $1,500 a month, and your landlord says, the market's great now. Rent it for $1,700 now. So if let's say you have 2 months that it was empty. So you're going to go after your tenant for those 2 months. But then, so for the additional 8 months, you got $200 more a month. So for those 8 months, 8 times 2 is $1,600. You're going to have to give that tenant a credit for $1,600 that the landlord got extra money in his pocket. Right. Right. So you can only go after him, but you're only responsible for that too. But it takes it a step further. For the extra months that are left, if the landlord makes more money for the extra 8 months, they got to credit that to the tenant also. Can't what?
You're not charging double rent.
Well, it's not double rent, it's charging extra. You can't get more than you can now. Will the tenant ever know? Probably not, but if they do know and come after you, they'll come after you. One of those tenant attorneys. Right, because we had that discussion about that property too. Right, Patrick? That's the discussion we had on your property, yeah.
I'm assuming they paid that.
Oh.
saying that the tenant paid those last 2 months even though they vacated. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what happened in this case is if it was empty for 2 months at 1,500, they're only responsible for 3,000. But let's say you rented it right away and you got 1,600. Well, you can't go after the tenant
I
for,
thought you can't rent it right away.
you can.
That tenant has paid those 2 months.
No, if they haven't paid, sorry, if they have not paid. Obviously, if they paid it, you don't want to, right. But just be careful, the moral of the story is if you're renting it for more money, the landlord doesn't necessarily get all that extra money. You got to be careful that the tenant may be entitled to a credit for that. Okay, what if you have square footage problems where the seller states the square footage was correct, but it's actually different from the records and the buyer has put down the deposit? Buyer or tenant? Can the buyer lose the deposit and how can you correct the problem? Okay, well, this sounds like not a landlord tenant. Meanwhile, the seller's agent will not return the deposit back to you. All right, we're going a little off book now, but let's kind of answer it. The square footage problem states the square, I don't know where it was because, you know, the property appraiser, as we know, is not always right. So that does happen. That square footage that you have in the MLS where it draws it from, which is usually from the property appraiser, and you guys you've heard me say this a million times, there's probably I'd say a 35 to 40% error rate in the property appraiser, whether it's on the legal description, square footage. So there are differences. Now, most of the time where it comes in is they enclose the patio and it's not part of it. So, the thing is, so if the square footage where the seller states that the square footage was correct, but actually is different from the records. Well, the problem is in the contract, you usually don't have, this contract is contingent upon verification of the house being 3,300 square feet. So we'd have to look at it in more detail to see if there could be a claim back for the deposit. But you know, if something is, the property appraiser says 3,000 square feet, and then the appraiser comes back and it's 2,800 square feet. Does that necessarily mean that the buyer gets their deposit back? No, because there's nothing in the contract that has that. Don't forget, the MLS is not a contract between the buyer and the seller. It's an agreement between the agents to cooperate on certain terms of the sale.
But this would be if they're leasing the property and they think it's 2,000 and they find out it's 1,500 and they say, I don't want to rent it now, they give the deposit back.
From a lease? Yeah, let me tell you, now let's go into that, because in residential, you don't put square footage. Guys, don't. It shouldn't be in your lease, it shouldn't be in there. Now, commercial, it's very common and it all, the question about square footage, you know, on a residential lease, you do not put the square footage in a residential lease. There's absolutely no good reason to do it. Now, on commercial leases, it's common and it's always in there. On our leases, what I do is I put in there, you know, the space is approximately 3,000 plus or minus square footage. The rent is not dependent upon the actual square footage. This is only an estimate. There was a string of litigation in the 80s and early 90s over that, because then it became the question is, how do you measure? Do you measure from the outside walls or the inside walls? So what happened is all these tenant attorneys were suing their landlord saying 3,000 square feet. Well, yeah, if you measure from the outside, but if you measure from the inside, it's 500 square feet less for this warehouse, and 500 times, you know, $15 a square foot, that's a lot of money. So the commercial guys even now put in there, it's only an estimate, not to be relied on. And then again, do you measure from the outside walls, inside walls, or from the center point? So there's all, so you stay away from square footage. You don't want to get caught in that trap.
What about in your marketing for your rental property? Put in the square footage.
Approximately. Yeah, first of all, if you've got it, yeah, if you put it in there, you say, you know, approximately 2,000, and I always put +/- square feet.
That's in that folio. It asks for the number, you know. But I guess in the description.
Yeah, in the description. If it won't allow you put in there, it's approximately +/-.
And also you should put in your rent is not based on square footage, just in all of our descriptions.
Okay, that's a good idea too. The idea is put in your descriptions. Rent is not based on per square foot price. That's a good way to save it. Okay.
Based on market.
What's that?
based on market.
Yeah, well, yeah. All right, liens. Liens can be claimed by anyone when rent is due, and you can make a claim on the property, on the premises, or off in possession of the person. Now, there's something called a landlord's lien. Has anyone ever heard of that? Very, very rarely used, especially in residential. You can't put a claim on beds, bedclothes. Shows you how old the statute is, bedclothes, or wearing apparel. But technically, if a landlord, and especially it's in the upper end, let's say someone's got, that 5,000 square foot house in Islesworth, and it's got lots of great furniture and they're not paying, the landlord technically could have a lien, a landlord's lien on the contents. Now, it's more likely in commercial where they'll put a landlord's lien on equipment that's in there. Again, it's very, very rarely used, but you should realize that it is an available remedy that's out there, which takes us to what they call is distress. And this is what's called a distress writ. Again, very rarely used. It's available for people who have rent that's owed. The action for distress writ can be filed in the county where the property is located. They have to state the name and the relationship of the defendant. So it will be a landlord, it will be claiming against the defendant who's the tenant, how the obligation arose, a lease, the amount due, and whether payable money and other things of value. 9 times out of 10, it's money. Sometimes it could be trade for services. The writ will enjoin the defendant from damaging, disposing, defacing, secreting, or removing. And again, this is mainly used in commercial venues, because let's say there's a $15,000 a month rent and they're not paying, but they have all kinds of equipment in there. You're afraid they're going to disappear in the middle of the night. So what you could do is go and get a distress writ, and the order from the court will prohibit them from doing this. And if they don't, it's contempt to court. So again, mainly used in commercial. I've seen it done a few times in residential, and it's really when it's high end. So if the plaintiff does not successfully dissolute the writ, the sheriff can levy on it. The plaintiff can file a bond, at least double the amount. If the verdict then is in favor of the plaintiff, then it's sold, and then it's sold by the sheriff to go against the amount that's owed. If it goes on appeal, the defendant would have to put up a bond, otherwise it would be sold. Again, not really used a lot I've never seen it done in residential. Commercial, I have seen it done. All right, what methods can a landlord use to obtain payment for back due rent? By filing a civil action in a court of competent jurisdiction, by making a claim on the security deposit, by filing a suit to obtain a writ of distress, by executing upon a landlord's lien, or E, all of the above. Good, everyone's paying attention. You can do them all, and you can do them simultaneously. So you can go get a distress writ as part of your action, and you can then execute on your lien. So there's a lot of remedies. And again, Florida is very landlord oriented, which is good if you're a landlord, bad if you're a tenant. All right, so when you terminate the lease, so the tenant, they have the option if the landlord does not properly maintain the premises. All right, this is what we call the 7-day letter. How many people have gotten a 7-day letter from a tenant? Surprising, because let me tell you, when I get that call, Barry, get me out of the lease. Why do you want to get out of the lease? The landlord won't A, B, C, and D. Well, if the landlord is required to do A, B, C, and D, then we send what we call the 7-day letter. Under this, it must be sent in the way the lease says, certified mail, whatever the lease requires, and says, landlord, you've got 7 days to A, B, and C, these things that you're in default of the lease, and if you don't, the lease, under Florida law, the lease is terminated. The tenant can walk away and won't owe anything. Landlord, there's no screens on the house, as required by statute. Landlord, throw it away, they can leave. Biggest things it comes up with is, especially in the summertime, they don't fix the AC. They don't fix a plumbing problem. It goes on and on. Now, what happens, the question comes up is, well, what happens if the landlord finds out about it and I just can't get it done in 7 days? It's an old air conditioner, I need a part. Okay, but so then what the courts would say is you need to notify your tenant in writing, let them know that you have addressed the problem, it requires a part, and offer them an alternative, either a rent abatement or alternative housing. You don't have to give them alternative housing. You can do it for the per diem, or just give them a credit. So, but this is the biggest way that a tenant can get out of a lease, is given that 7-day notice to fix. The landlord, so what do? If the tenant doesn't properly maintain the premise or comply, if they don't comply, okay, so this first thing, it does not apply to rent or rules or regulations. So you have to give them the right to cure. And if it doesn't, if it's a continuing or subsequent non-compliance with the 12 months warning. So this is what we call the 7-day to the tenant. So let's say that they're just loud and the neighbors are complaining. Or let's say they're misusing, they're not watering the lawn as required. Anything in the lease that they're not doing. So it's reverse. And what it says is the landlord can send a 7-day letter to the tenant. Because, I mean, look, sometimes we have the situation where your landlord's like, this tenant is a nightmare. Get rid of them. Well, you're going to say, well, how can I get rid of them? They're paying their rent. Well, the neighbors are complaining. They haven't watered the lawn. Failure to maintain. Anything else you do, you can send them a 7-day. That's a way to get rid of your tenant also. So it works both ways. I have had actually a landlord that wanted to get rid of their tenant because they would just every other day it was something else. Every other day it was something else. And we just sent and the tenant said, you can't get rid of me. And I go, oh yeah, we just did. You're gone. And they went to an attorney and the attorney said, yeah, they're right. They're right.
The tenant, how are they not abiding?
In this case, it was the tenant was not allowing the landlord's personnel in to make repairs. They would complain about them, and the landlord's like, well, oh, you didn't make an appointment. Or you need to make an appointment when it's convenient for me, and I work 9 to 5. You have to make it other time. No, you can't come in. So they were just being unreasonable about everything. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander, as the old saying goes. All right, so the biggest thing is the 3-day notice. So if the tenant doesn't pay rent and continues to be in default for 3 days, they can terminate by written demand for payment. Now, the courts are very, very strict on this. This is what they call, this statute is strictly construed. If you don't follow the statute, you don't give proper notice, the judge will just dismiss your case. There's no, well, it was a holiday, oh, it was late, the 3-day notice is the 3-day notice. Yeah.
If you have a tenant that is continually late month after month, and every month you have to serve that 3-day notice, is there a point where the landlord will say, listen, we've served you 4 3-day notices 4 months in a row.
So the question is, if every month they're late, basically, can you terminate the lease? No. Now, you got to look to your lease. There may be other remedies. Like, for example, some leases say that if tenant breaches the lease more than twice, is in default of the lease more than twice during the term, that the landlord reserves the right to terminate this lease. So if it had language like that, yeah. Yeah, so you got to look to your lease and make sure you have a good lease. But yeah, but then again, you get your late fees, you get other fees. All right, so acceptance of or payment of rent with knowledge of non-compliance waives the right to terminate the agreement and bring a civil action. Partial payment of rent does not waive the landlord's right to terminate. All right, now I take the position, and I advise the clients don't accept partial rent. Because some of the judges will say, because they'll say, well, I paid half the rent, but I didn't pay the other half because they won't fix the air conditioner. So it's a policy decision you and your clients have to make. I take the position we don't take partial rent, but some do. So you got to just work it through and decide how you're going to decide to do that. All right, true or false? When a landlord voluntarily accepts full balance of past due rent, they waive their right to file an action for eviction. True or false? Ooh. I have to have a button to make it lock in that you can't do it anymore. Okay, the answer is true. So if you do a 3-day notice and they pay, you can't sue them. They paid. Can't do it. Now, if you sue them on other grounds, failure to maintain, something like that, then you still can go after your eviction. But money talks. They don't pay, they pay, you can't sue them for eviction.
That's why I've been told not to, once we've done the 3-day notice, not to accept any partial payments too.
Right. Now, if they do pay the whole thing, you can't say, I'm not taking the payment. So let's say they owe $1,500, and then with the late fee or whatever it is, it's $1,700. You serve a 3-day notice. You can't turn around and say, oh, I'm not taking the $1,700. Well, that's what I'm saying. You can take partial. You can. I don't recommend you do it.
No, but how do, like, we have ours on an automatic, they pay online. What do you do? Just
Can you set the system not to accept partial payment?
Yeah. No, you have it so it doesn't accept it.
So the question is, if you're on one of AppFolio or something, so you can set the software to not to accept partial. All right, so that's the answer. Set your software not to take partial payments. Yeah.
Well, and you can also set it to not accept any online payments.
Yes.
That's better because sometimes
Yes,
the
yeah.
roommates, they only pay partial anyways.
Yep, you got to kind of deal with that. Yeah, so the question is, if you have roommates and they accept partial, your software may not be able to do that. So yeah, you kind of just got to deal with the technology of what's there. All right, termination of lease. So if you have a non-specific written notice for non-specific terms, here's what it is. If it's year to year, you got to give no less than 60-day notice. Quarter to quarter, no less than 30 days notice. Month to month, no less than 15, and week to week, 7 days. All right, let's focus on month to month, because this is always confusing. Because everyone says, oh, I don't have a lease, they're month to month, right? And then the question is, oh, how much notice? I want to get rid of the tenant. How much notice do I have to give? Most people say, I got to give them 30 days notice. That's false. If it's month to month, no less than 15 days notice. However, here's the kicker. It has to be 15 days, no less than 15 days prior to the end of the term. So today is the 14th. All right, so you have a month-to-month tenant, and if you give them notice today, when is the soonest you could tell them to be out? What date? Huh?
What's that today?
Today the notice is sent.
Tomorrow?
No, you can't give them a notice today and say you got to be out tomorrow.
No, but you say Saturday, or is that 15
No,
days?
when's the soonest legally you can tell them they've got to be out?
Or the 10?
Correct. The 31st of March. Okay? Now, if we give that notice on the 16th of March, when is the soonest they can be out? April 30th.
Oh, because of the end of the term is.
Right. You have to give them a minimum of 15 days notice prior to the end of the term. They're a month to month. The end of the term is March 30th. So the 14th, you're good. The 16th, you haven't given them 15-day notice. This is the biggest mistake that landlords make. Well, I got to give them the 30-day notice. They're month to month. They got to give, well, great. If you want to give them 30 days, you're good. But if you want them out sooner, you can.
Just 2 weeks notice to be out in 2 weeks?
Yes.
Unless it's after the 15th. It's 15 days prior to the end of the term.
April 30th.
Sorry?
If you gave a notice the 16th, then they would have to be out by. April
Right. So if you gave them,
30th.
no, if you gave them you're a month to month. It goes from the first to the end of the month. So if you gave them notice on March 16th, 30 days, at least 30 days prior to the end of the term is month to month. So you got to be out April 30th. So just remember, if it's before the 15th, you can get them out that month. I ever had problems. So this is the easiest way to remember this. If you give it before the 15th, they're out that month. If it's the 15th or after, wait till the next month. If you just remember that, you'll never screw it up. You'll never miss it out. So always to do that. Statute does say that you may have a provision requiring no more than 60 days notice. Okay, foreclosure. This doesn't come up so much, but who knows with the recession next year, it may. Tenant may remain in possession of the property for 30 days. The purchaser has to give written notice of 30 days of termination. If the notice is given, the purchaser may apply for a writ of possession, and it's based on a sworn affidavit. Because these tenants were being displaced, and the statute is to give them at least a 30-day notice. The big banks work with people, even though they're the big bad banks. They don't want that publicity of throwing people out immediately. That a lot of times do have to deal with them. Now, as property managers, it puts you in a bad position because you're sending the money to your landlord, and what happens if they're not paying the mortgage? Most of the property management agreements we do, we put in there that the landlord, the owner, represents that they are current and they will become current and will notify them if they are not current. Now, if they stop becoming current, we usually put an out in there that says the broker has the right to terminate the agreement. Let me tell you a big mistake I keep seeing is, I don't know why people do it. So let's say you work for ABC Real Estate, LLC, and you're managing the property. They do a lease and says the landlord is ABC Realty, LLC. How can you do that, folks? You don't own the property. You can't rent it. When you go to bring an eviction, whose name you're going to bring it in? Now, I property manager, well, we do that because we want to bring the eviction in our name. Well, the first offense I would bring up is you don't own the property. So how can you be, never mind renting it, how could you be evicting? And it opens yourself up to liability. So you want to have your leases in the owner's name. And just like when you sell a house, you want to make sure that the name on the property appraiser, which you verify by hitting the hyperlink to look at the exact deed, is the name of the landlord. Because what happens if it's a trust? You don't have the right entity. If it's more than one person. So a lot of times you may have, let's say you have a husband, wife, and a daughter. And the husband and wife are up north and the daughter's here and she was living there in college and now she's renting it out, and they come to you and you rent it out. You don't have mom and dad's signature on the property management or the lease, it may be considered not valid. So you got to make sure you have the right parties that are on it and make sure it all matches up. Now, the tenant in there does not apply if the tenant or the immediate family of the mortgage or the foreclosure. The rental agreement is not a result of an arm's length transaction, so they won't. So let's say that the person who's foreclosing, if the tenant is their immediate family, or the rental agreement's not arm's length. So, for example, what happened is landlords were putting people in there a $1,500 a month property for $500 a month. So what the courts are saying, no, that's not an arm's length transaction. We're not going to uphold that. The landlord, the new landlord, the owner can get rid of the tenant, less than the subsidy, unless it's subsidized. Of course, if it's government subsidized, you can't throw them out. All right. So what happens is what typically happens is they get an eviction. They get the 3-day notice. Then the tenant is served. They can get served with either a 1-count or a 2-count complaint. Count 1 is for possession. Under the statute, they have 5 days from serving to file a response with the court. If they don't file a response, then they're defaulted. Then the judge signs an order, and then the clerk of the court has to issue a writ of possession. then the writ of possession has to be delivered to the sheriff. Then the sheriff will go and post it, put a big orange sticker and says, I'll be back in 24 hours. If you're still here, then you're out. Now, the sheriff is not a moving company. A lot of landlords think that. It's up to the owner to get rid of the stuff. The statute says you have to move it to the closest right-of-way. So if you're in a condo way in the back, you can't just dump it out right there. That's the condo property. You got to bring it out to the street. Once it's on the street, and the sheriff will not help you. So make sure you have movers, make sure you have people to do that. And you've got to move it out there.
You also need a locksmith.
Sorry?
You should also have a locksmith with you and change the locks.
Right, right. You need to, yeah, in case your tenant changed the locks, the sheriff is not a locksmith either. So, you know, a lot of times once they get that notice on there, they leave, but some of them don't, and the sheriff has to remove them. Now, of course, if they're sitting in there and they won't, and they refuse to move, the sheriff will arrest them for defying the order. But you've got to move the stuff out there to the right of way. And a lot of landlords, if you're property manager, and going, well, that's your problem. Well, okay, I'll arrange it, but you should charge fees for getting it done and having it done. Now, if they do get served in those 5 days and they say, yeah, I shouldn't have to pay, the landlord didn't fix the air conditioning. What happens then? Out you go. Out you go. All right? The only way you get to stay is if you put the money into the registry of the court. I didn't pay rent because the landlord is a slumlord, and judge, take a look at this place. I'm placing the $1,500 in the registry of the court, and I want a trial on this. Then the tenant gets to stay. You can do a counterclaim. The judge will sort it out. The judges have sympathies for people. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. They're pretty good at reading these people. All right. Now, if it's really a disaster and they show up with pictures and all that, you know, the judge say, do you have the money? Yeah. The judge will say, you know, the landlord will say, Judge, they didn't put the money in. I'm entitled to a writ right now. The judge isn't going to throw them out. The judge will say, you have till tomorrow afternoon to put the money in the registry of the court. If not, though, it will be, you will be evicted. And just FYI, generally the courts between Christmas, the week before Christmas and New Year's will not sign writ of possessions. They don't want to be like Scrooge. The last thing they do is want to have the publicity of someone getting thrown out and being on TV of throwing them out. But they are pretty good about sifting through, because you know you think you've heard it all. Talk to some of these judges; they've really heard it all. So now, if you also do a second count complaint, that's for monies owed. Some landlords don't do it. Like a lot of the apartment complexes, they don't do it. They just do a writ of possession, that's it. If they're going to go after them for the rent, they do it separately. A lot of the smaller landlords say, yes, file a 2-count complaint. Then they get served with 2 summonses. One is 5 days, pay or get out. The second one is you owe $3,000 in rent. That one, they have 20 days to respond. If they don't respond, they'll be defaulted. Then you get a money judgment. Now, the problem is collecting on it. Florida is known as debtor's haven. It's hard to collect against people because there's a lot of exemptions. Head of household exemption. You can't garnish their wages. So there's a lot of different exemptions. A lot of landlords don't go after them. We have people all the time that they'll call us up. Oh, a guy owes me $3,000 in rent. I want to sue him. Great. But before you do that, you may be throwing good money after bad. Sometimes I have landlords that say, I don't really care. I just want to do it. I said, okay, you want to frame it on your wall? That's great, because it'll be hard to collect. You know, the credit bureaus do pick up on it. So it's really a business call that they have to make whether they want to go after them for the money. Most landlords don't, because it is hard to. But if you have a husband and wife and one of them is head of household and they're both working, yeah, you can go after the other spouse's wages and get a continuing writ of garnishment and get your money sooner or later. Did you do it or not?
Well, I have to.
Oh. Okay, so how to get possession is obviously by a civil action. The tenant can surrender, abandonment we kind of talked about. Here's another thing. What happens when your tenant dies? Anyone ever had that? Yeah. So technically you've got to deal with an estate. And sometimes if there's no estate opened, then you've got to deal with it. Get legal counsel on that. If an estate's not open, then you've basically got to do the abandonment proceedings. That's why it's so important when you take your application to have an emergency contact for somebody, so so you can contact the family. Because the last thing in the world is if you don't have someone there and they don't know the person died, and they're not in the area, you're stuck with that stuff. You got to send out the notices, and it could tie up your property for a couple of months. All right, questions. So a couple of things while you're thinking about questions. First of all, make sure you have a good property management agreement. Sets forth what your agreement is with your landlord. So that way everyone knows their rights, duties. Because one of the biggest problems is when repairs have got to be made. The last thing you want to do is having to go to your landlord, for every $5, $10, $20 thing. Get an agreement up front. If anything's under $300, let's say, you've got permission, set up a protocol of how that's going to happen. Some landlords are like, look, under $300, I don't really care, just get it done. Some may say $300 is good, just email me. Some of my brokers have it in there. They email them. If they don't respond back within 24 hours, it's deemed approved. So, but get on the same wavelength. Now, how many people, when they're property managing, inspect the property throughout the term of the lease? How often do you inspect?
Twice a year.
Twice a year. Quarterly. Folks, if you don't inspect, you're going to run into some problems. I just have I got my broker and my leasing agent just got sued by this is the most bizarre lawsuit. They're all bizarre. So they rented to these people 6 years ago. 6 years ago. Everything was great. About a year ago, the tenant stopped paying. They had in their management agreement that they do inspections, and they did inspect twice a year. When the people left, they trashed the place. They are now, and they know that the tenant is uncollectible. They're suing the agent and the broker. Well, we got the agent dismissed from the lawsuit because there's no thing. It's bizarre. They said that the broker had a duty to guarantee, to make sure that it was a good tenant. And since these people stopped paying, they obviously weren't a good tenant and they weren't doing their job. I can't wait for the judge to just laugh at them. Really? You've been there for 6 years paying good and all that, and all of a sudden, you guys are not guarantors of payments. They also said they breached a fiduciary duty, but we inspected and made an inspection. So they're going after, they realize that the broker's got insurance, errors and omissions, so they want to go after that. And they're just going after, they're trying to go after them to get money, because everybody is sue happy these days. Was there anything else they were suing for? By the way, this is David Berman, who's another one of our attorneys.
The first complaint had the fiduciary duty and then the breach of, it was an unusual account. It wasn't even a cause of action.
That's when we got dismissed.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's why you could be a revenue source too. Why not ask your landlord and say, do you want us to perform inspection services? Well, what do you mean? Well, we recommend going out quarterly and we do a walkthrough, make sure everything's okay. Oh yeah, that's great. Okay, well, you charge for it. I don't know, maybe change.
They want everything included.
Well, they do, but maybe you do include it to set you apart from your competition. I don't know. I'm not telling you how to do business the way you want to do business. But if you don't inspect, make sure you have something in there. I would give them a box to check. I've declined the inspection services that's been offered by my broker. Therefore, there will be no periodic inspections, and any destruction or put some magic language in there that you're not going to be responsible for. Because I see this coming up more and more now, that landlords are upset because people don't give a damn anymore, and they just leave properties. So kind of be aware of that. And, again, people don't care. They just trash the places and leaves. Let me ask you a question. I'm kind of curious because I got a lot of property management people here. What percentage would you say, I mean, there's little things like cleaning or stuff like that, but what percentage would you say when people move out, do you have serious claims? How many? 20%. About 20?
Serious ones.
Serious.
Something that there's-
Okay. Okay, 20% is not bad. That's not bad.
The biggest thing is tenants are suing. They're gonna sue.
Yeah, but they all say they're going to sue and they never do when they find out how much it is to sue. Yeah, yeah. They don't do that. So now some things you got to consider when doing, again, don't use that FAR lease. Because some of the terms that we go over with like landlords, if you have us do your property management package, you'll go over your contract, set up a lease. Because some of the things we do in the leases that makes it easier for you is, some people, landlords like it, some don't. Automatic renewals with a 3 or 4% increase. Personally, I use it on all my properties. I just put it's automatically renewed with a 3 or 4%. I don't have to worry about it. If they don't give me notice, it's automatically renewed. The other thing some landlords like to have a provision is if they sell the property, the new owner can terminate it upon 60 days written notice. It's always some good things to do. There's one management company in town here who will remain nameless. They do a lease, because I had a tenant that came into me and said she moved out of the property and got a invoice and a letter from an attorney that said she owed $8,000 for a new air conditioning system. And she says, how could I owe $8,000? They wouldn't even come fix it during the last month. And they said, I'm responsible. I looked at their lease. Tenant, it was written like a commercial lease. Tenant was responsible for everything except the roof and the structure. And it specifically said it, if the air conditioning breaks, you have to repair or replace it.
And the tenant signed that?
Huh?
And the tenant signed that
Yeah.
lease?
Yeah, they didn't read it. Okay. Does tenant discovering lead paint allow for 7-day notice requiring landlord to remedy the property or they will terminate the lease? I've never had that come up.
This was on there was on Yellow Heights, District District. Someone had, the house was, the tenants, the owner was having the house pressure washed and the paint came off.
On the outside.
Yes, and the tenants had the paint
Tested.
positive. They have children that play in the yard. They want to know what they can do about this. I didn't ask that question, but I noticed that, and this is happening here.
So well, first of all, the lead paint is usually for interior,
Right.
not for exterior. What's the landlord going to do?
This is a question I was up on Yellow Heights.
So they were pressure washing it and then some of it came off? Was it the underneath the head lead or the exterior?
Something I read on Yellow Heights.
Yeah. I'd find out, first of all, what the landlord's going to do. If the remedy is that they're going to repaint the entire house, then you've solved the problem and sealed it in. It shouldn't be a problem, but it's got to be addressed. But can they terminate?
The landlords should clean up the paint chips out.
Well, you got to take care of it. What their remedies are, I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up.
You can leave, and then you take.
How to evict and get rid of possession if you don't know if the people live on the property? Well, if they live on the property or not, I'm not sure did someone ask that here? Okay. If they don't live on the property and you think somebody else is in there, then when we do the suit, we would do John Smith and Mary Smith and unknown tenant 1, unknown tenant 2. And then when the process server serves, they go, who are you? Oh, I'm John Doe. Okay. I'm Mary Doe. Okay. And who are you? Oh, I just live with them roommate. What's your name? John's. Okay. Then they know who it is. So you put unknown tenant. And that's how you do it if you think, so that's how you do it if you don't know if they live on the property. What happens if you find out during an inspection that the tenant has other people living in the property that were not in there? You send them a notice of default. You send them the 7-day letter that they're in default, and if the people don't get out, you as the landlord, or the landlord has the right to terminate the lease because they have people living in there that are not authorized to live in there. What do you do if you inspect and the place is trash, but they pay on time? Again, that's the 7-day letter. Cure or you're in default. So you do that inspection, send them the letter, you get rid of them. You have the right to.
What if they don't want to leave after
Evict them. Yep. The court will throw them out. How many times in a year do you inspect the property? At least twice. So that way you got the beginning and the end. So then you've got, quarterly. So twice during the inspection period. What rights do a landlord have if after the tenant moves in and the landlord finds out false information given on the application? Well, you should have done your due diligence. And it depends what the falsity is. A lot of times on your applications, it has language on there that says if anything in here is false, it's the right to terminate on there. So you need to do your due diligence. Per se, let's say they lied about their income. Is that enough to probably get rid of them and they pay? Probably not. Does it?
The problem was the tenant had put down false landlord information, and when the verification was done, the person that was on the application verified that yes, they paid on time, blah 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 blah. Come to find out after the tenant moved in, lease was signed and everything, that person did not own that property that they claimed they lived in.
So what they said, but the question for everyone is they put on there that they were the tenant on another property, and then later after you rented, you found out they weren't the tenant?
No, the tenant put down false landlord information.
Okay, so you called up the landlord and someone was lying for him and said it was them and they paid on time?
Yeah.
It was actually an attorney, too.
Well, the attorney was the tenant or the landlord? Huh?
The lying landlord.
The lying landlord? I would report that attorney to the Florida bar. That's an ethical violation that you report him to the bar. That's the end of his license, or he'll be reprimanded. Now, again, it depends on what's on your application. If your application has some sort of statement on it that says any false information, it could be subject to terminating the lease. You can get out of it. If you don't, it'd be pretty hard to get rid of them. Okay, what happens when the tenant gives the last month's rent up front and then the last month comes and last minute they don't want to leave? Huh?
Oh, it's like that was nice.
Okay.
So when you make the lease, they give a deposit and then they give the last month's rent. Then
Okay.
they say, okay, this is our last month, so we apply that last month to that month, and then they don't want to leave. Like they want to all of a sudden continue the lease.
Okay, they become a tenant as sufferance. They're a month-to-month tenant, and then you have the option to charge them double the rent. Simple as that. But why wouldn't you want to keep them?
No, we don't want to.
No, we
But
didn't
they
want
want-
to, but they
Hmm?
want to stay.
They
So
want to stay
But why don't you want to keep them?
because they pay very bad. They don't
Okay.
pay on time.
All right. Yeah, and just you get rid of them. Or maybe a solution is make them put up another security deposit. 2 months instead of what? Oh, you still want to get rid of them. Yeah. Yeah, you just got to give them the notice, and then they become if they don't, you could evict them, and then they owe double the rent.
Okay, so if we don't come to an agreement of them staying, then we can
Yep.
proceed to an eviction.
Yep. Does letter from HOA management company have more weight than just one neighbor regarding problem with tenants? Well, I mean, yeah, but they both have great weight. I mean, does someone in here do that question? So someone elaborate, whoever put that on there. Does that mean like noise problem? I mean, obviously, if it's a noise problem and it comes from an HOA, yeah, it would probably have some more weight than just a neighbor, because then the tenant's going to go, oh, that's that one neighbor. I got some scuffle in with them. They just don't like me. Yeah, but it doesn't matter. Either way, it's a violation of the quiet enjoyment provision of your lease, and it shouldn't matter whether the complaints. The inadequacies of the FAR, where do I begin? Where do I begin? There's just a lot of stuff that's just not addressed in there. One of my biggest beefs in there, it has that provision at the end. If you want to breach the lease and you want to get out of it, check the box, 1 month or 2 months, or whatever it is, rent, and you're out of it. Why would you ever do that? I would never let my landlord do that. Why do you want to give them the easy out button and then have your place empty for a few months? And I've had one agent said, well, it's a blank, and I'm just told I have to fill in all the blanks, so I have to do that. No. There's a lot of provisions that aren't in there, like there's quiet enjoyment. I mean, there's a lot of different things in there. It's just it's a horrible, horrible lease. Okay, the HOA had required prior approval. Okay, so the tenant, so that's a good question. So what happens if you find out they rented you the property and the tenant finds out that the tenant had to be approved? The HOA could move for eviction. So yeah, it's a problem. The tenant would have a great case against the landlord. You as property managers would never do that because you know whether your property needed HOA or COA approval. But yeah, there's a lot of rights the tenant would have and damages for that. No, there is there a percentage or cap on the amount of rent that can increase when renewing? No. Nope. Unless your lease says that. Now, if you have a provision that says there'll be an automatic renewal at 3%, and then the landlord says, yeah, I just, market conditions, I want 5%, the tenant can go, no, you're stuck with 3%. So you got to abide by that. So you can rent for whatever you want to, anything you want to rent for. So know the documents you're using. Keep good track of stuff. Keep on top of your tenants. Try to keep a good relationship with your tenant, because the worst thing is you get in it like this with them. Sometimes you got to play referee between your landlord and your tenant. And sometimes that's what you end up going to do, because sometimes you've got landlords who don't want to fix stuff and you're put in a very bad situation. So sometimes you got to walk away from the deal if your landlord is not maintaining or violating the statute, because you don't want to become a party to that, because that could come back and haunt you. Okay, let me look at this. Oh, did I get those? We got that. Got that.
They went off the screen because there were too many questions.
I think that one, there was one about like, how
Whoop.
much do you charge for lease?
So don't forget, turn in your forms. All right, next month is all about addendums. So we give you a great package. We go through the deficiencies in the FAR/BAR contract, which is a few, but we talk about addendums. This is the biggest problem that agents have, and the most litigation that comes up on stuff is addendums. So next month, come, invite some friends to come, because it's a big thing. Biggest part of litigation against realtors right now is addendums, because you guys shouldn't be writing them, but I'll give you a nice packet with all of them. All right, did we find some?
Well, it looks like it's going from most recent to the.
What do you do if you inspect and the place is trash, but they pay on time? Whoop.
Okay.
What happens if you find out during an inspection that the tenant has we did that too.
There's one about how much do you charge to prepare a lease?
Oh, okay. Generally, if it's a one-time lease, one-time lease, what we do is, it depends on what you're using it for. Property manager or one-time, it's usually in the $400 to $600 range, depending on what you want and how much stuff you want to have in there. Don't forget, you guys can only fill in the blanks. That's why a lot of people say I use the FAR, because that's the only one I'm allowed to do. That's not true. If an attorney prepares your lease with fill in the blanks, you can fill in the blanks from an attorney prepared lease. And when we have property client managers, what we do is they'll have a standard lease, but if anything changes, they'll email it over to us. We approve it, or we make some changes to it. The other thing, don't forget, is you can only enter into a lease for 1 year or less. If it's a year and a day, by law, you cannot prepare the fill in the blanks. All right. And if you're one of our property management clients, what we do is, if that comes up, you'll fill it out. You'll send it to us. And we review it and then approve it, so you can do it for more than a year. What happens when the tenant gives the last month up front, the last month? Oh,
I think that's the
That was
only
it.
one.
okay. I get them all? Okay, I'll stick around if anyone has any questions. Don't forget, Anyone that needs help on their stuff, let us know. Our attorneys are here to help you as part of the process. A lot of good stuff coming up in the market. Market's still strong. Wish we all had more inventory, but if we could do anything, let us know. Don't forget, when you get a listing, do that free title search upon listing. It will save you time down the road.